Now, I may have mentioned this before on the show, but for many years I was the host of the Radio Classics channel, Channel 118, on Sirius Satellite Radio. And old-time radio is a big passion of mine, also a big passion of Martin's, and he's written extensively on the topic of old-time radio. And Martin, which came first, your love of old-time radio or your love of the Twilight Zone?
Old-time radio was my first love, but Rod Serling himself was actually a fan of radio drama. That's how he got his start as a writing career. He would write for programs like Dr. Christian and Grand Central Station and the First Nighter program. And ironically, when he later ventured over to television and then eventually got his own show, The Twilight Zone, he would take some of those local Cincinnati radio dramas that he did and adapted some of them into Twilight Zone episodes. So like Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, believe it or not, that was originally done as a radio drama around 49, 50, 1951 maybe, on radio. But being that it was a local radio station at the time, unless you lived in Cincinnati and just happened to remember many years later, hey, I think I heard this story before, they wouldn't have put one and one together.
Right. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned the radio series Grand Central Station, because a little while ago we had author Jim Rosen on the program, and we were talking about the TV series Naked City. And Grand Central Station was sort of like the radio precursor to an anthology show like Naked City.
Grand Central Station. Grand Central Station. Crossroads of 1 million private lives. Gigantic stage in which are played 1,000 dramas daily.
It seems like right from the start, Rod Serling was looking to make a name for himself with anthology shows.
Correct, and he always wrote for anthology programs. The one that he really got his big break was Dr. Christian, and that was unique because unlike, some radio state programs, the producers would buy unsolicited manuscripts. Unlike today, you need to have an agent and has to go through agencies, and it's who you know. Back then, people basically wrote it in submitted their own scripts, and the producers would read them, and they would actually buy them and use them. And then they would have a contest once a year, and Rod Serling wrote one, and he actually won, I think, second prize. And ironically, the first prize that same year was a young man named Earl Hamner Jr., who ultimately wrote a few scripts for Twilight Zone as well.
Now, judging by the time frame here, Serling couldn't have been working in radio very long before he jumped to television.
It was a short period of time, yes. He did a few unknown anthologies, or unknown by today's standards, but when he managed to win an Emmy for Patterns for Kraft Television, immediately his name was thrown up in the spotlight. And from that point on, he was able to get more prestigious jobs, and the bigger name shows, especially when they were sponsored and not syndicated, there was more money. And CBS, when they decided to do Playhouse 90, he wrote the first two scripts. And, of course, the second one, Requiem for a Heavyweight, stole the Emmys that year. And CBS basically thought of him as one of their bright, shining boys. And whatever they could do to keep him writing for their network and not any of the other networks, they gave it to him.
It seems like The Twilight Zone was a bit of a risk for Rod Serling. I mean, he could have stuck with Playhouse 90 and made himself the Norman Corwin of television.
Correct, and he had that option. He basically was very good at coming up with original stories. He tried to find some controversial subjects, of which, Patty Chayefsky and all those others, Reginald Rose would occasionally do for the other dramas, dramatic programs. When he wanted to do Twilight Zone, he always had his favorite love was fantasy and horror. So he would listen to Suspense, Quiet Please, Mysterious Traveler on the radio. And to get his own television show, CBS said, well, science fiction really is kind of juvenile. Because if you look at it, at the time, science fiction was Space Patrol, Rocky Jones, Space Ranger, Tom Corbett. It was never taken as a true serious medium. And so ultimately they gave him what he wanted, only because the contract stipulated that he could have his own show. They would produce 50%. He would produce the other 50% through his Cayuga Productions under two conditions. One, he had to accept a late Friday night 10:30 time slot, which pretty much was dead because you're going up against Friday night fights.
Right.
So CBS really gave him a dead time slot. Looking back now, we all think that it was the big program when it first aired. It was a small cult following, but nothing like big-name shows today. The other stipulation was he had to submit at least 3 scripts for Playhouse 90 every year. And that basically, because he would not write any more Playhouse 90s unless he got his own show. So they both basically agreed to help each other out. And that was really the only reason he got Twilight Zone, was because of Playhouse 90.
Geez, talk about a workaholic.
Oh, yeah. So anybody who does a job that they love, it basically becomes their second life. And it is amusing because he didn't just write scripts for the Twilight Zone, Playhouse 90, and other shows. He was busy taking his scripts and making them into short stories for short story anthologies and collecting extra money. He was busy doing everything like guest appearances on Jack Benny's show and quiz programs. And surprisingly, he took time to answer fan mail, and he got an estimated $5,000 a week. And one interesting letter was a girl who lived in New Jersey who wrote a letter and said, "I've been going through art school, learning about art design, and I want to, I'm looking at Twilight Zone, and I noticed that you guys have some sort of art design, production in the background. You don't just take any painting and hang it on the wall,
right,
because if it distracts the scene." And he wrote back and said, "Well, if you ever get over to California, I talked to the production manager. He will sit down with you for a few hours, and you can be on the set for 2 days while they're actually putting the sets together and doing some of the rehearsals and so on." And she did, and she took him up on the offer. But how many people read fan letters and decide to do that and out of courtesy?
And of course, he wouldn't have received those fan letters had he not been at first the voice of the Twilight Zone and then eventually on camera. And from what I understand, that wasn't something that was planned on.
No, Westbrook Van Voorhees was a known name, and he did the narration for the unaired pilot. And it worked briefly, but he was not available. So then they approached Orson Welles, and Orson Welles kind of held back. And if he was never 100% interested, Welles never took anything that it was being offered. And eventually Serling just said, "Screw it, I'll do it myself." And he did. And by a second season, somehow it came along that they should have him on screen as well.
And now, Mr. Serling.
Next week, a distinguished actor lends us his talents, as Mr. Burgess Meredith stars in Time Enough at Last, the story of a man who seeks salvation in the rubble of a ruined world. We hope you'll share this very strange experience with us. Thank you, and good night.
And I think there was a blessing and a curse to that. The blessing was that it brought him some fame, but the curse was it's not the kind of fame you want. Alfred Hitchcock himself said that he enjoyed doing cameos in his movies until the TV show came along. Then when people realized and started noticing, wait a second, that's Hitchcock in the movie, they started playing the Where's Waldo game of where Hitchcock was. And I think by 1959, starting with North by Northwest, Hitchcock started appearing in the earliest opening scene of every movie. It was no longer fun popping up anywhere in the movie. And Rod Serling said he couldn't go down the street without people pulling him over and wanting their photo taken. He liked it at first, but after a while he realized it was also taking away part of his personal time.
I want to talk for just a moment about rivals to the Twilight Zone. Obviously, One Step Beyond and Tales of Tomorrow, which I think predates the Twilight Zone. But the big one is The Outer Limits. What's your opinion of The Outer Limits?
Oh, I love The Outer Limits myself. I think Joseph Stefano was a fan of Twilight Zone. You can clearly see it evident. And he followed the rule that Rod Serling applied, and that is, if you want to speak prejudice or talk about the evils of whatever social commentary of the day, you can't get it past the networks, but if you have an alien say it, you can.
Yeah.
And Rod Serling was enamored by what they were able to do because he felt that The Outer Limits was a step up from what he had originally intended for Twilight Zone. And they had the Twilight Zone, I think the Outer Limits premiered their first year of the two was the last year of the Twilight Zone. And had Twilight Zone gone another year, Serling was already in the works for bringing in more aliens, more space alien creatures, and trying to do more what The Outer Limits was doing, because he realized the Monster of the Week program was what people really wanted. In other words, Outer Limits was an extension of what Twilight Zone did and a step above, and then Serling was going to actually go that step above and go, they did exactly what I would love to do, but he was going to go up one, but he never got the chance.
Well, the far-reaching implications of the Twilight Zone, you see it manifested in shows like Star Trek. I mean, Gene Roddenberry basically took that same idea. He had social issues he wanted to comment on, and of course he could hide them in the guise of, another world having these same social problems that we have here on Earth.
Correct, and it's a good point, because if you look at it and name the 5 best science fiction television shows today, Star Trek and Twilight Zone are probably 2 of the top 5.
Yeah, and both of those shows are rerun constantly. Do you have any idea when Twilight Zone first went into syndication?
Probably right after it went off the air, around 64. My guess is around 65, 66, it went into syndication. CBS, sometime in March of 65, bought Serling's half, 50% ownership of the show. So that's why CBS owns all of it today. And they turned around and started syndicating it around the world, and other local channels after that. And over the years, I'm sure they've made quite a lot of money off it, not because of DVDs, which they never anticipated back then, but syndication, you can make at least something off it, basically by selling the syndication packages to stations.
Because I'd like to think, obviously Rod Serling passed away in 1975, but I'd like to think that he was aware of the impact of the show and the continued popularity of the program.
He did. When he was teaching at a college during his later years in the 70s, or especially during and after the Night Gallery, he ended up, he'd play an episode or two for his students, and they would talk about television writing and the craft. And he would actually be very critical of some of the episodes that he didn't like, and which ones he did like, and so on. In fact, he was very harsh against Walking Distance, which, in my opinion, is probably the best episode of the series. But he was harsh against it, but he would have his students say, "Oh yeah, I remember watching this one years ago." So everybody had watched it who basically took his college had seen Twilight Zone, and he knew exactly what kind. It wasn't Night Gallery people remembered him from during the 70s. Surprisingly, even though that was the newer show, they knew him from Twilight Zone.
That's some of Bernard Herrmann's memorable score from the episode Walking Distance. We're talking to Martin Grams Jr., author of The Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic. Martin, what are some of your favorite episodes?
I think Walking Distance is probably the best. Excellent script writing, excellent music. Bernard Herrmann's music makes that, and Robert Stevens' direction makes that good. Other classics, as guilty pleasure, I always liked Mr. Garrity and the Graves from the 5th season. And I'd say probably it was one that never stuck with me at first, but over time it became a big one for me, was Death's Head Revisited from the 3rd season.
At the top of this interview, I mentioned that you were the organizer of the Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Convention, and I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that for a little bit before I let you go. Tell us about that convention.
Well, the Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Convention is a 3-day non-profit film festival. It's sometimes compared to as the East Coast version of Turner Classic Movies Film Festival, although we don't have, 700 people sitting in a massive theater auditorium watching a film on a big screen. But we bring in about between a half a dozen to a dozen celebrities. They do Q&As on stage to answer questions from the audience. They sign autographs, pose for photos. We screen rare films, a lot of them from the Library of Congress. Most of them are not available on DVD and are rarely shown on TV. So it gives people a rare opportunity to see something that's, once in a lifetime. There's like 200 vendors there. There's slideshow presentations all week. If anyone's ever been to a convention, even like a Comic-Con, they know exactly what I'm talking about, and it really is geared to anything pretty much nostalgic, from drive-in movie theaters, old-time radio, Twilight Zone, old movies, and it's worth going to. I mean, where else can you go to actually, have your photo taken with Ed Asner and have Catwoman herself, Julie Newmar, signing autographs for you? And it's really fun.
Well, it sounds like what's the date for this year?
This year is September 18, 19, and 20. It's held right outside Baltimore. It's in Hunt Valley, Maryland. It's at the Hunt Valley Wyndham. I believe the hotel changed its name recently, the Wyndham. And there's a website if they want to check out schedule of events and celebrities. And we still have celebrities getting ready to be announced. but they can check it out. It's www.midatlanticnostalgiaconvention.com, named after the event Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Convention.
And what about the book, The Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic? Where would listeners go to find that?
There's two places. Amazon.com, of course, is the first one. Slightly cheaper in price, and it's direct through my website, which is named after me, martingrams.com. When they order it from there, they can ask to be autographed. That's something they can't get on Amazon. I will say the book is like a cockroach killer. It's the size of a phone book, and it's pretty big.
Yeah, this is the definitive book on the Twilight Zone.
It won 2 Best Book of the Year awards, and the funny thing is the first one, which apparently is a major award, I never knew existed until people started emailing and saying, "Congratulations, you got nominated for a rondo." And I went, "What's a rondo?" And then a few months later, "Congratulations, you won the rondo." And I went, "Okay." And the book is detailed. I mean, not everybody's going to want to know the music cues or care about the dates of production, but to see the cost factors is interesting, to know if they needed permits to film on location, if their microphone appears on the screen, hint, hint, 3 different episodes, it's pointed out. So it makes it more fun, even if you've already seen the episodes and probably seen them 2 or 3 times. It's one of those where people have told me, it's great, every time they air one on TV or they have a marathon on the Sci-Fi Channel, they said they pull my book out, they go through during the commercial break, and they read some trivia and go, "Oh, I never caught that," or "Oh, that's about to come out," and they see stuff, and it makes it more fun.
Martin, I want to thank you so much for being our guest today.
Oh, my pleasure. Glad to be on the show.
And I want to remind everybody that the book is The Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic. My advice to you would be to pick it up and start reading it now, because you never know what might happen tomorrow.
Books! Books! All the books I'll need. All the books I'll ever want. Shelley, Shakespeare, Shaw. All the books I want. All the books. That's not fair. That's not fair at all. There was time now. There was all the time I needed. That's not fair. That's not fair.
The best laid plans of mice and men, and Henry Bemis. The small man in the glasses who wanted nothing but time. Henry Bemis, now just a part of a smashed landscape. Just a piece of the rubble. Just a fragment of what man has deeded to himself. Mr. Henry Bemis in the Twilight Zone.